were designing this workshop, we were looking for richness and diversity. And there is one thing you should not do if you are looking for richness and diversity. Invite an economist. We failed. The idea is to force us to open up our minds. But the thing that we are facing is that there is a widespread argument, both shared by policymakers and academics alike, regarding the need of having a solid domestic front in order to project power. And the idea is that if you have poverty and inequality within, you are not able to project either power or soft power outside. We wanted to see whether this is true and what are the consequences. You know the official discourse in Brazil and China. In Brazil they say they have taken out of poverty 30 or 40 million people in the last 10 years, when in China they speak of 300 or 400 million. The idea is that these societies are becoming middle-class societies, and this is helpful both to mobilize resources, hard power, and to seduce and attract others, soft power, fome e zero, feel hunger, and the like. So we wanted to know two things. The first one is whether this is true. Are these societies becoming middle-class societies, or these middle classes are not what we were expecting them to be? Are we seeing giants with teeth of clay? The second question, which is maybe not to be answered in this session, but we need to think about it, is what are the consequences, whether this is true or not? What are the consequences of these societies becoming middle-class societies or not becoming middle-class societies? Is it important for developing foreign policy? Is it important internationally, or it doesn't matter? Britain became a power in the 18th century, and it was a very unequal society. So maybe we are focusing on a wrong value. Now Julián will try to illuminate us, at least regarding the first question, because he has been working in the World Bank with this research team that developed the concept of vulnerable society, and he will explain what this is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrés. I'd like to thank the PRIMO Workshop for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been learning a lot. I think the worst that you can do was not only to invite an economist, but to invite an economist who tries to play more than what economists typically do, which is what we try to do in this report. We're going to be doing clearly something very different from what you've been hearing so far. We are going to be seeing lots of tables and numbers. As economists, we are better at producing numbers than we are at producing ideas. And this is what this report is about. Basically, it's trying to characterize and to come up with a definition of the middle class that is robust, that has some meaning. And then look at that definition and look at countries and see how this middle class has evolved and so on and so forth. Most of this talk is going to be based on this book that we published a couple of years ago with a bunch of colleagues at the World Bank, Chico Ferreira, Melanie Golini, and Luis Felipe Lopez Cava, Mariana Lugo, and Renan Bakis. This book has two parts. The first part looks at mobility, people who is moving up, who is moving down in Latin America, and the second part looks at middle class. I'm going to be only talking about the second part, about what the middle class is about, and I'm going to be adding some things that have been happening in the last couple of years that were not there when we published this book. Now, you don't need to go to Mumbai to buy this book for $4. You can just go to that webpage, worldbank.org, like economist, and you can download it. It's for free. Whether that's an indication of quality or not, and to you to decide. It is public good, or that. So, the presentation is going to have 5 points. First, I'm going to introduce a little bit why we want to write today a book about the middle class in Latin America and the Caribbean. Andrés have already introduced this quite a bit. Then I will talk about how to think about the middle class, how to define the middle class, what are the different options, and what were the options we took for this book. Then I talk about trends, how the middle class has evolved in Latin America, and I'm trying to say something about the rest of the emerging world with a few numbers that we have. And then we will come to the more sort of speculative part of the book, where I typically say, we always feel a little bit uncomfortable about this last part of the book because we are more speculative, we have to think more. And I'm hoping, when we talk about the middle class and social contract in Latin America, that here we open a discussion and actually very much interested in hearing your views and learning from what you know about these things. That is probably much more than what I know. And then I will conclude and just illuminate some possible policy implications. So this is true throughout the world of emerging markets, but it was particularly true in Latin America. That the 2000s, for those of you who are not familiar with the data, have been extremely good years for Latin America. You can see that in two different graphs. The first graph is the one that I have at the top left corner of that slide, which shows three lines. The red line is GDP per capita in Latin America. This is an unweighted average of 15 Latin American countries, which covers pretty much 96% of the Latin American population. We are basically missing all the small countries because they don't have consistent data over time. But what you see is that GDP per capita was growing very, very little throughout the 90s, and then it just takes off in 2003. The magic year in Latin America is 2003. We still haven't figured out why exactly 2003, but everything changes in 2003 for Latin America. GDP per capita grows from something like $8,500 at the PPP, purchasing parity power, to some $10,500. So it's a large increase in GDP per capita. The other two lines show poverty, the poverty numbers, two different definitions of poverty. What we call extreme poverty, which for Latin America, and I will come back to those numbers later on, is defined as having less than $2 a day per person in the household. That's the lower line there. And the upper line, colored line, so I think is yellow. The yellow line shows what we call the moderate poverty rate, which is households that have less than $4 a day. But basically, the two lines show the same trends. Up to 2003, they were fairly flat. There was nothing happening throughout the 90s in terms of poverty, even though GDP per capita was increasing slightly, which brought up all this discussion about whether growth was enough to actually lift poverty, lift people out of poverty. But then after 2003, when GDP per capita takes off, poverty declines dramatically. It basically reduced by half, either moderate poverty or absolute poverty. By 2012, we have some 15% of people in what we call extreme poverty, and some 30% on moderate. So these were years of high growth, and as you see, fairly inclusive growth. There was a big reduction in poverty, and that was happening because not only we grew, not only Latin America grew fast, also inequality fell very, very rapidly. This is what the second graph shows. Basically, inequality, this is a measure of inequality, is the Gini coefficient. I hope you're familiar with it, but if not, just believe me, it's a measure of inequality. It's a measure of inequality that goes from 0 to 1. As you go closer to 1, you're more unequal. And there was a reduction of about 4 Gini points in Latin America, an unweighted average of the reduction in the Gini coefficient, which is a huge reduction. 4 Gini points is a lot of, it's a big reduction in inequality. And it happened across the board with a few exceptions. Costa Rica didn't reduce inequality. Uruguay, which was the most equal country in Latin America at the beginning of the period, actually increased inequality slightly. In some countries that were very unequal, Peru, the inequality reduction was huge. A reduction of 8 Gini points within a decade is pretty much unprecedented within modern economic times. Of course, Latin America was the most unequal region in the world, but throughout the 90s and 80s, eventually inequality was increasing, but not really declining, and we see this very sharp reduction in inequality in Latin America. Which means that this growth happened at the same time as those at the bottom were the incomes of those at the bottom were growing much faster than the incomes of those at the top. It's an interesting pattern which is also inconsistent with what was happening in most of the rest of the world, where inequality is increasing, as you probably have heard. All right, so this 2009, we are looking at these trends, and these obvious trends raised obvious questions. So these are the questions that we try to actually tackle in this report. So how about those that escape poverty, that those millions of Latin Americans that escape poverty enter into the ranks of the middle class? Are they really a new middle class? How vulnerable is this change? You've seen that there was a very rapid increase in GDP per capita, so growth was picking up at levels that we have never seen in Latin America for such a sustained period. So to what extent can we expect that there is a reversal once growth sort of fades out, which is what we are observing right now in Latin America? So how resilient is this new class that is coming out of poverty and becoming possibly middle class? Does it look different, this new middle class, as opposed to the previous one? And what are the implications of these social changes? A few words about the rest of the world. The rest of the world is becoming middle income. That's unquestionable. Middle income defined as having a GDP per capita more than $1,000, which is the definition that the World Bank uses for middle income. There are some numbers there. 72% of the world lived in middle income countries. In 2011, as opposed to 22% in 1990. This is to a great extent China and India, that became one upper middle income and the other lower middle income countries. But also GDP shifting towards this part of the world. 45% of GDP originated in middle income countries, as opposed to 21% in 1990. So it's basically double the share of GDP that is accounted for by middle income countries, as opposed to high income. Now, is it the same to become a middle income country as to become a middle class society? Obviously not. And in order to answer that question, whether these are middle class societies, we need to come up with a concept of middle class, a definition of middle class. And this leads us to what basically will put most of the effort in trying to think about how to define in a robust way a middle class. So defining a middle class is obviously very different. I'm not going to tell you what sociologists say about middle class, because you know much better than I do, but sociologists tend to think about middle class associated with certain professions that people have, or certain educational levels, or even more complex, multidimensional definitions of middle class. We wanted to have a definition of middle class that was easy to compare across the world. We wanted to say where Latin America stands against the rest of the world. And as economists, we are very simple-minded. We think about things that can be easily compared, and the best way to compare things is using incomes, right? So most of what economists have done in characterizing the middle class is based on income. But once you decide you're going to define a middle class based on income, then you have a lot of choices. It's not obvious what the definition of the middle class should be. You can have relative definitions of the middle class, which is basically you define the middle class as those that are in the middle of the distribution. For instance, there is a recent report by the OECD that defines the middle class as those that have 150% of the median, are between 50% of the median and 150% of the median. We played a little bit around with sort of relative definitions, but the problem with relative definitions, we don't have a definition that would say what people sort of perceived as middle class. For instance, that in Uruguay there is a bigger middle class than in Haiti. A relative definition would not do the job, right? Because there's always people around the middle of the distribution. It would not do the job of actually telling you how trends have changed, whether you are becoming more middle class or less middle class, because it's a relative definition. There are obviously then absolute definitions of middle class, and there are hybrids. We are going to use an absolute definition of middle class, which is basically saying there's a threshold of income after which you become middle class. The question is what the threshold should be. And here the literature is clearly not unanimous at all. There are several papers that economists have written about middle classes, and they define the middle class sometimes with some justification, other times with no justification whatsoever, but based on different lines. For instance, Ravallion says middle class is between $2 a day and $13 a day. Why $13 a day? Because that's the poverty line of the European have more than middle class if we have more than what the poor have in the US. Why the US? Banerjee and Duflo have a definition which is $10 and $10 a day without much of a justification. There is a very interesting paper by Taraz that looks, he's more interested about what the middle class implies for consumption patterns. So he actually has this definition of middle class that has nothing to do with what the rest of the people have done. He says middle class is being between $10 a day and $100 a day. Why 10? Because it's the average poverty in Portugal and Italy. Why 100? Because it's twice the median income of Luxembourg. Why Portugal and Italy and not Greece and Spain? I don't know. And there are other definitions around. Well, I'm not going to claim we have the best definition, but we are at least trying to justify it somehow. So what we try to think is, okay, how did we measure at the World Bank, which became quite popular, way of measuring poverty using absolute poverty line. So how was poverty measured? The famous measure of $1 a day. The famous measure of $1 a day comes about from thinking what is the basic functionality that makes you non-poor. What makes you non-poor? Well, having a minimum calorie intake that allows you to nourish yourself properly. That's one possible definition of non-being poor. What they did when they actually developed this definition is they said, okay, let's look at what is the basket of how many calories you need to survive. Let's look at different countries, what the basket of goods, what type of basket of goods provides the basic calorie intake. Let's translate, once we have this basket of goods, we translate it into a measure of income, and this magically came into the number of $1 a day that has been revised over time. Now is 135, what they call the extreme poverty line. The question is, what functions define the middle class? Well, we know that one function that defines the middle class is the resilience. Middle class has certain ability to save, has certain ability to weather negative shocks. So you are middle class if you actually are hit by a shock, but you don't become poor. Husband loses the job, or the wife loses the job, and there is some insurance within the family in terms of assets, or also provided by the state, that basically allows you not to go back into poverty. So our measure of middle class is going to be based on this concept of economic security. The basic function that the middle class fulfills is actually having some economic security. It's obviously a measure that can be skewed, but we think it's a measure that makes sense, and it's a measure that gives us something we can measure. So how are we going to sort of try to bring in this idea of economic security? Where we're going to say, what is the minimum income level that provides you a low probability of falling back into poverty? And that's going to be our measure of middle class. So what we went on is we look at the few countries in Latin America where we have panel data. What is panel data? Is data set where you follow the same family over time. So we took the families that are not poor in a given point in time, and we look at them several years later, and we ask the question, what is the probability that you became poor, considering that you were not poor to start with? And how that probability changes over the income distribution. How the probability changes depending on whether your income was $100 a day or $10 a day. And this is what we plot in this graph for 3 countries, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. This is the probability of falling back into poverty, conditional on not being poor in the initial state, over a period which changes between the different data sets. It goes from 2 to 5 years. I think in Chile it's 5 years, and in Mexico and Peru it's around 2 or 3. And you find obviously what you expect, right? Here we are measuring poverty as the poverty line is it's a line which we call the moderate poverty line for Latin America, which is $4 a day. It's a line that is higher than what we use for low-income countries. There are reasons for that. We can enter into that in the discussion if you wish. But we could have done it with what we call extreme poverty line, which is $2 a day. But here the threshold is $4 a day. So what is the probability that conditioning on you being above $4 a day, 4 years down the line, 3 years down the line, you are below $4 a day? And obviously, if you have $5 a day, which is here at the top, your probability is very high. Probability is around 70% of being back poor 3, 4, or 5 years down the line. If your income was $20 a day, there at the other side of the graph, then the probability is extremely low, is close to 0. Now, having a probability of 0 of falling back into poverty didn't make a lot of sense because there are statistical errors. So we use the statistical concepts that we think are reasonable, and we typically use a 10% threshold as being a sufficient entity to not be sure whether you actually are poor or not. So we think that 10% is a sufficiently low probability of falling back into poverty to call you a middle class. And somewhat magically, as you can see, basically all the countries have a very similar pattern in terms of how those probabilities of going back into poverty decline as income increases. And they all cross something that we like, and that's why probably we choose 10% and not 5, we could have choose 5. But they close to $10 a day. So that's going to be our lower sort of threshold of being a middle class family. You have to have more than $10 a day, because if you have more than $10 a day, your probability of falling back into poverty is less than 10%. You are very resilient. We are not absolutely convinced that this was the best possible way of going about it. So what we did is we actually double-checked this number. How did we double-check this number? We used people's self-perceptions of what does it mean to be a middle-class family. So there are a number of household surveys in Latin America where they ask people, are you upper class, middle class, lower middle class, or low class? Are you poor? So we basically imputed income, because that survey didn't have income. It's a complicated process to impute income into this type of survey, but one can do that. And then we said, okay, what is the threshold that defines the difference between those that define themselves as middle class and those that define themselves as poor? Well, if you ever look at these type of surveys, you will immediately know that this answer is tremendously difficult to find. This answer is tremendously difficult because people, we are all middle class. In surveys, when people are asked, are you poor? Nobody says they're poor. When they ask, are you rich? Nobody says they're rich. I remember when we talked about this definition, we were talking with a professor in Argentina who claimed in the same dinner that she was able to call on the phone 5 ex-presidents of Latin America. This is a person that is relatively well off, and then we asked her, so, are you rich? No, I'm middle class. Yeah, a very special middle class. Well, luckily this survey divided into, the people who designed the survey were smart enough that divided what they call lower middle class versus upper middle class. So what we're going to call poor here are poor and lower middle class, and we're going to call middle class are going to be the upper middle class. All right? And this is Mexico. What this shows is the density in the responses of people declaring themselves middle to upper class as opposed to lower to middle class, which is the green line. And as you can see in Mexico, these two distributions cross at $10 a day. So at $10 a day, there is more people, above $10 a day, there is more people that consider themselves middle to upper class, which is our measure in this survey of middle class, than people that consider themselves low class or lower middle class. So in Mexico, magically, our threshold based on vulnerability coincides perfectly with the threshold based on people's self-perceptions. Now, is the world Mexico? No. Each country obviously had a different crossing. Mexico and Peru cross at 10, which is very supportive of what we find. But in other countries, in Chile, you have to go all the way to 20 to find more people that defend themselves to be middle class as opposed to lower middle class, upper middle class as opposed to lower middle class. So what we conclude from this is that the 10 that we sort of have found in the analysis of vulnerability seems to be a lower envelope of what all of these countries declare themselves as being middle class. So it makes very little sense to talk about the middle class with a definition that goes below $10 a day. But that was kind of reassuring. All right, how much time do I have? 15 minutes? All right, then I have to move a little bit faster. All right. All right, so this is the first time you see this graph. This graph we are very proud of. This is the income distribution in Latin America. We have basically put together here millions of observations coming from household surveys. Actually, these are 15 household surveys pulled together using the same measure of income, basically income at the household level, per capita at the household level, and we plot where the income distribution lies. Now, I've been talking a lot about the lower bound of what makes you middle class. We said less than $10 doesn't make sense. But I haven't said anything about the upper bound. What distinguishes the middle class from the rich? Well, being totally honest, we are going to define the upper bound at $50 a day, and there is very little justification. We did much less work about the upper bound. And there are two reasons for this. First of all, we are not going to say anything about the rich, because most of the analysis that we do in this book is based on household surveys. And we know that in Latin America, household surveys misrepresent the rich by a big amount. They are very bad in representing the rich. The rich live in private compounds with people with machine guns in there, so the interviewers just cannot get there. The other reason is more practical. If we actually have put this threshold, by putting the threshold at $50 a day, the upper threshold for the middle class, we basically leave out in the rich something like 2.7% of the Latin American population, according to the household survey. So as you can imagine, if you put the threshold at 45 or at 55, nothing changes because there are very few people in there. At least when it comes to characterizing the middle class. Of course, it would change in terms of how we characterize it. But the most interesting part of this graph, I think, is that, well, I said I'm going to define the middle class as resilience to falling back into poverty, which is $4 a day. This gave me a lower bound of 10. Basically means that we have four classes in Latin America. We have the poor, those that are between $0 and $4 a day. We have the middle class, those that are between 10 and 50. We have the upper class, that goes 50 and above. And then we have a class in the middle, those between 4 and 10. Now that is a very small bracket, but it's where most Latin Americans are. As you can see, this is the mode of the distribution. Everybody's kind of concentrated there. We're going to call these guys the vulnerable, precisely because our definition of middle class is based on lack of vulnerability of poverty. These people, those that are here, are more vulnerable to falling back into poverty. And as you can see, these people are going to be very important in the whole story. All right, so once we have the definition of middle class, we can bring together all these household surveys, not only for the year 2009, which is what I was showing here earlier, but we can plot middle class status, poverty status, and vulnerable status over time. And we basically find the same things that I was telling you earlier. Poverty was fairly flat between 1995 and 2003, and it starts declining, and the middle class picks up in 2003. By 2012, I think 35%, 34%, 2013, the numbers are not out yet, but they are around 35%. The middle class has not changed much. So, is Latin America a middle class society? Clearly not. It's only 1/3 of Latin Americans who are middle class. Basically, 2/3 of Latin Americans are still either poor or vulnerable to poverty. Interestingly, as you can see in the graph, as middle class increases, so does the share of vulnerable. So there are more vulnerable people in Latin America than there are middle class today. But what is also remarkable is that there is a larger middle class than the poor. By 2012, there were about 25% of people who were moderate poor in Latin America. Of course, there are lots of difference across countries. The countries that we know are middle class in Latin America, so I don't obviously confirm, but by our numbers, Uruguay and Argentina, and to some extent Chile. Some countries, El Salvador, Bolivia, have a very, very small middle class, an incipient middle class.
Could you stay in?
Sure.
Are you looking for Brazil?
Well, no, I was what kind of compare everyone. Okay, okay.
Yeah, Brazil is one of the countries where the middle class grew fastest, but it's country that was starting from a lower level than, say, Argentina and Uruguay. All right, how about the rest of the world? Well, the rest of the world is moving into the middle class. The big region that has moved very dramatically into the middle class is ECA. You can see here Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The middle class grew very dramatically from something that in 2000 was less than 15% to something that is almost 40% by 2010. Latin America is the other region where middle class status grew extremely fast. These are relative numbers, relative to population. So you're thinking, oh, where is China? Well, China, in relative terms, still far from being a middle class society. Now we will see in absolute numbers, it's becoming a huge middle class world. But there's been increases in pretty much everywhere in terms of middle class status, except for South Asia, where India is still very far from taking off. Lots of people entering into what we call the vulnerable state, but not yet middle class. And Sub-Saharan Africa, even in Sub-Saharan Africa, there was some increases in middle class status. Now, we do things that we hate doing, but sometimes you have to do for this type of report, so we actually put these things into a model that makes some assumptions and say, okay, what's the middle class going to be by 2030? Because this is what the press likes, so we have to. And obviously, as you can imagine, China dominates the picture of middle class. This is 2005 as opposed to 2030. China is the red line. If trends stay the way they stay throughout the 2000s, the middle class in China will be about 1 billion people. So the world is clearly moving into a middle class world, but we are still far from it. Interestingly, the country that is not moving much in terms of middle class, that is still very far from being middle class, is India. All right, why did middle class increase in Latin America and the rest of the world? Well, growth was a very big part of the story. What we show here is the contribution of inequality and growth in changes in poverty status and changes in middle class status in two areas, in ECA and in LAC. And you see two contrasting things going on first. In ECA, it was everything due to growth. There was actually very little having to do with inequality. Inequality, if anything, increased a little bit in ECA. In Latin America, the reduction in inequality, which is here, had a very big impact in the reduction of poverty, which, because inequality fell, but fell a lot because the lower tail of the distribution, there was a lot of growth among those who are fairly poor in terms of income. There was also a lot of some contraction at the top, but there was more of a large increase, contraction at the bottom of the distribution. But when we look at what matters for middle class status, even throughout this period where inequality was declining very rapidly, growth was much more important for those that moved into middle class status than it was the reduction. Same in ECA and Latin America, but in Latin America both went in the same direction. The reduction in inequality helped a little bit in the increase in the middle class, but growth has a much bigger impact here. All right. What characterizes the middle class? You can take this household surveys and ask questions like, so how does it look a middle class household as opposed to a vulnerable and as opposed to a poor household? And we find things that are not very surprising, which are basically what you expect. The middle class is more educated, so the head of the household has on average 10.6 years of education as opposed to 7 years of education. In the case of a vulnerable household, is more urban, has smaller family size, so has less kids. Perhaps the most interesting part is that the middle class household is not necessarily a bureaucrat. The head of the household is not necessarily a bureaucrat. There is this concept, there is this idea that the middle classes in Latin America were very associated with the state. There were people working for state firms, so they were working for the government and so on. Well, this doesn't seem to be the case. Basically, 1 in every 5 people who are middle class, the head of the household is working for the public sector. So 4 in every 5 is working in the private sector, mostly having formal jobs rather than informal jobs. established that the middle class has grown. What are the consequences for this growth in the middle class? This is where I expect you to actually tell me more than what I actually am going to tell you, and I hope we have a debate about this. But we did a few things. There's obviously, in the literature, even economists think about these things sometimes, and they claim that middle class status societies that have middle classes are good for everything. They are good because middle classes have a higher tendency to consume, so basically they are going to boost internal consumption, and through that channel they are going to boost growth in the economy. But also, middle classes are kind of nicer. They believe in democracy more than the poor, and they believe in the importance of free markets, but also they believe in redistribution more than the rich and more than the poor, and so on and so forth. Now, testing these sort of predictions is terribly difficult because you don't have that many countries to actually draw hard evidence from it. We did something that I think is the best thing that has been done, but still is far from totally bulletproof. But what we do here, we build a data set that is pretty amazing. We basically build a data set which is, by the way, available, which basically tells you how many people are middle class around the world in 107 countries. And we did a regression in which we tried to control for the possibility, the big issue here is whether middle class is creating more democracy or more democracy is creating middle classes, so the useful causality issue. This regression claims to actually get the causal impact. I doubt it. But we actually looked at whether middle class status across countries and over time is associated with good things. And what we call good things are more expenditures, public expenditures on health, more public expenditures on education, less tariffs, so more openness, more credit market liberalization. And in terms of governance, we look at the quality score and we look at corruption. And surprisingly, around the world, you have to read these numbers as a race between middle class, which is a variable that captures to some extent inequality and GDP per capita. It captures a measure of distribution, and these two things here, we control for inequality in this regression, and we control for GDP per capita. So the interesting thing is that, for instance, if we run this regression without putting in middle class status, GDP per capita has a very large impact on corruption and poverty. So more democracy, less corruption. However, once you include middle class status, kind of middle class status dominates. So there seems to be something about middle class. Well, at least this is what these numbers are telling us. Middle classes, countries with larger middle classes are associated with more public expenditures on health and education, less tariffs, this is the first line here. And everything has lots of stars, which means it's statistically significant. But as I said, these numbers are, we have 107 countries, which we observe 2 or 3 times in different periods. We have like 216 observations. Not bulletproof. But there seems to be something. Now, this is the world. This is 107 countries, right? What happens in Latin America? Unfortunately, if I don't believe these numbers very much, less I would believe them if I was running this regression in Latin America only. There is very little variation to actually say something. But we can do something. What we did is try to see whether there is some sort of middle class particularism. Is the middle class different in terms of values than the other 2 classes? So we took Ecosocial, where we have already sort of derived a measure of income, and we actually asked, okay, what's the difference in all these political attitudes, trust in institutions, political alienation, perception of mobility and opportunity, legitimation of political violence, etc., etc., etc. Is there a difference on how you answer between being poor, middle class, and rich? The answer is yes, there is a little bit of a difference, but the differences are very, very small. There are large differences across countries. So in a way, a poor in Brazil is much more similar than a rich in Brazil than a poor in Peru. There are large differences across countries, but there is very little variation associated with income in terms of these political attitudes. So we conclude this maybe the middle class has some sort of particularism, but this particularism doesn't seem to come from values, from different values of of the population. It may have a particularism in terms of self-interest, what the middle class needs as opposed to what the other classes need. And indeed, there seems to be something going on in that dimension. What the middle class in Latin America is doing is trying to be rich. That's what they do. So they're trying to behave like the rich do. What this graph shows, for instance, on the left is how many parents send their kids to private schools. And this is for different income brackets. So this is our middle class, these are middle class, these are the rich, these are the vulnerable, and these are the poor. What you can see is basically the rich overwhelmingly send their kids to private schools in Latin America, and the middle class, there is a big jump. This is these lines here. These lines here. There is a big jump here in the middle class status. Even the vulnerable are jumping, right? They're trying to send their kids to private schools. We look at different indicators. The middle class also opts out from public health services. They buy their own health insurances when they can afford it. They opt out from policing. They buy their own security. That's what most Latin American rich do. In the Dominican Republic, this is my favorite graph. In the Dominican Republic, they even opt out from electricity. Since electricity provision is so unreliable, what the rich do in the Dominican Republic, they just buy their own generators. And that's what the middle class is trying to do as well, as middle class status increases. So we are here in a very complicated situation in which in Latin America's people's income grow, they are opting out from the social contract. They're opting out for these public services. This is coupled with, obviously, an unwillingness to pay taxes, right? Taxation in Latin America, the capacity of the state of collecting taxes is very low, with the exception of Brazil and Argentina, where it's very high. And we can enter into that discussion during the discussion later. This may be behind some of the revolts in Brazil in the World Cup, in the preparation for the World Cup. So there is very little taxation, very much based on indirect taxation, with very limited redistribution capacity. So this is the Gini coefficient of different definitions of income. Here we have market income, which is what you get from whatever source of income. It's mostly labor income, but it can be returns to assets. This is net market income, where you're basically removing taxes. Here we move to disposable income, so we are basically giving transfers to people, cash transfers. As you can see, yes, there is some redistribution. There is less inequality as we move along, but if I was to plot, these are different Latin American countries. If I was to plot this for the OECD, I would have to use a different scale. Basically, in continental Europe, you would see this declining dramatically from here to here, from market income to disposable income. Big redistribution capacity. Here, there is very little redistribution. There is only one element when we basically, when we move to final income, what we call final income, we are imputing the education and health expenses of people. And since I said already that most of the rich don't use the public services, then those expenses are actually redistributory, because only the poor are using those services. Only the poor are going to the public schools, only the poor are going to the publicly provided health.
Is your why similar to OECD countries?
That I don't know. That I haven't seen done. That I don't know. I've seen this part of the story, and the big redistribution in OECD countries, my guess is that it's not. The big redistribution in OECD countries comes through taxes and transfers. Pretty much everybody uses public services, at least in continental Europe, but this may be changing. All right. So what are the conclusions and policy implications? Middle class definition based on vulnerability seems to work well. We are happy with it. Middle class is growing, but Latin Americans are still vulnerable to poverty or poor. So we are not a middle class society. We are moving in that direction, but we are not. And there seems to be this worrisome pattern of middle classes opting out from the social contract, not paying taxes and not demanding better quality of public services. What can we say about policy? Very little at these levels of generality, but there are two clear things that I think come out. One is that Latin America has done a revolution in terms of social protection systems throughout the 2000s. Now, the social protection systems in Latin America have been very much focused on social assistance, basically giving money to the poor, which is great. But now we have a very big class that is not poor, that may not be receiving this money, but that they are very vulnerable to poverty. So we need to think how we need to probably rebalance part of what we call social assistance into more social insurance. These people probably need insurance mechanism more than direct cash transfers. And the second big conundrum for Latin America is how to break this bad equilibrium of low taxation and low quality public services. We had a commodity bonanza that would have been a good moment of actually have lots of money, the public sector has lots of money. It would have been a good moment to convince people that you can provide good services and there is good reason for paying taxes. I think we missed that opportunity. Maybe better communication and maybe some excise taxing could be an idea. Basically saying, I'm going to tax you these, but I'm going to build these roads in exchange so you can see what you're actually getting from your taxation. And you.
Thank you very much, Julián. I have some remarks to do, but I will not do it. It's open the floor for discussion. You have the word.
Please start.
No. Your questions are more important.
I hope it's okay. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to put them together so you can answer them in sequence. The first one is not really related, just a quick one. U.S. impact on this kind of private solution to many things. So do they take examples from the U.S.? Like in California, they have these kind of gate communities. I don't know much about South America, so I'm just. The other one is the Catholic Church. Is it considered private or not? Because the Americans have this very strong Jacobites tradition. They might not actually find this Catholic Church schools as state schools, or there might be state money in it. So I don't know about this, how this is part of not part of the private educational system. And so these are the kind of more arbitrary questions. And the main question sequence. So, like in Fordism and also in like this whole middle class consumption demands approach, there's like a huge bottleneck. It's called resources. So when you do the projection, which you have to do for the journalists, obviously, do you actually look at how the resources will be, whether the resources will be available in the future for this kind of expansion in the middle class? Because the middle class obviously consumes more food, makes more waste, I guess, and so whether these two are compared, because otherwise often the middle class needs this kind of order because everything becomes more and more expensive and so on. And the third one is whether the access to resources is a key to having democracy by proxy, because of democracy kind of might be middle class. So, do you agree with those who agree that actually democracy is a privilege of the material resource and other resource affluent societies? There are many arguments for that. I don't want to miss any of those. I just want to see whether you buy into the general concept.
Actually, building on William's question, you said already that you don't like these forecasting exercises, and I know it's very fancy, of course, they're very trendy, but how reliable are they? Like, for example, I'm thinking in the case of Russia, there was in 2012 a study from Bloomberg saying that in 2050, 60% of the Russian population will fit into this middle class category. Now, obviously, is very strong bond between the middle class and a particular government.
Daniel, and then we come back.
Yeah. So as a social scientist, looking at this, my head is like bursting with questions. But I'll try. I like two. One is on method. One is on method. One is on the implication. Right. So on method, I was wondering when you're defining middle class, if there is any kind of way of using discretionary consumption, because if you have a mobile phone, are you poor? A mobile phone in the household, 10 mobile phones. If you've managed to buy a car, even if it's with credit or on loan or whatever, are you poor if you hold property like that? And it seems to me that patterns of discretionary consumption beyond surviving also define middle class, regardless of income. You can have really low income, but you've acquired mattresses for everyone. Does this influence it? Yeah. And the other thing has to do with credit, which didn't seem to appear much. But if you plot from the 70s or the mid 80s until now, the tendency is to have wage stagnation or wage decrease in many countries on average. And so I think middle class is heavily affected by widespread access to credit. And I think that would kind of maybe mess around with the values, because maybe you have very low income from your wages, but you can end up having enough income to make it to the $4 a day somehow. Yeah. And then on the implications, I don't want to say the word resent, but when you say opting out, it implies an option, right? Which might not be there. It's the same like middle class in Portugal is opting out of public health service. No. I mean, the data will tell you that, but that's not what's happening. There's simply no more service to be had. And so you are forced out of the public service. Right? In the same way, when you say, the state could have used excess rent from commodities, from the commodity boom, to do this, but didn't the state have to use that to make the middle class grow? For instance, in Brazil. So all of the money went into creating the middle class, so you can't have money to create the middle class and redistribute through public service so that they don't opt out of the public service. But yeah.
All right, that's a lot of questions. Thank you very much. These are all very good questions. I think I'm going to link the answer to the resources to the last question and the access to credit. There's been a credit boom in the 2000s in Latin America. Now, and that to some extent worried us in terms of seeing. And this credit boom was consumption credit. It was not credit for buying durable goods. It was credit for buying, durable goods, but not houses, not loans for buying houses. So this actually gave us a little bit of worry about, in particular in Brazil, where this has been very, very pronounced, whether this growth in the middle class was resilient because these houses were becoming very indebted. And I think we did some analysis of that, and there are two answers. First of all, in Latin America, it's true that there's been this credit boom, but it's also true that wages of those at the bottom have grown extremely fast. The stagnation that we're talking about is more of a stagnation of the middle classes in the developed world. In Latin America, the wages of those at the bottom and at the middle of the distribution have grown very, very fast. So the earning capacity of those at the bottom has grown very, very fast. So this brings me to the question of the resources. I'm not sure what you mean by scarce resources. If you think about the world today, the most important resource probably is human capital. Right? If you think that these skill bias technical change that is going on, that is making us all very reliable, is favoring those particular sort of type of abstract skills that people are talking about in the US, then those resources are not depletable. I mean, you can just accumulate as much as you want, and it's a question of actually being able to provide. I think you were moving more into physical resources, land, and the environment. And the truth is, and this connects to one of the questions earlier, when we did this forecast, for instance, we don't take into account that. We don't take into account the environment, and that would be interesting to do. I mean, it's already a very complicated model that is behind these things. If you take into account what the implications of the environment are going to be for these constraints, I think the story becomes even more speculative because we really don't know what is going to happen, right? My feeling is that whether these forecasts actually can be trusted or not, I think there are some that are more serious than others, but they are all based on, to some level, predicting that the trends that you have observed in the past are going to stay in the future. Is this sort of a reasonable assumption? I don't think so. I don't think China can grow the way it has been growing during the last 10 years. At some point, it has to change the model from an export-led model to a more import, sort of from a more of internal consumption type of model, and that is going to be extremely challenging for China. We are seeing it now. So I don't think you have to put a lot of weight on these forecasts. At the same time, it's undeniable that the world is becoming, I don't want to use multipolarized because this, but sort of more centralized in the way in which growth poles are happening, right? And I don't see an obvious reason why this wouldn't still be happening in the future. In particular, in countries which are investing very heavily in education, which are countries like China, India, and so on. I'm a little bit more worried about Latin America, where this is not happening. There was a question about what public services mean, whether Catholic schools were there, whether they are public or private. It depends on the country. But in most cases, they are subsidized. To the extent that they are subsidized, we count it as public. So what matters here is how much you consume from, how much is the transfer that goes to the household from the government. So if it goes to a Catholic school, it's basically considered as a public consumption of the public good in that sense. Yeah, I think opting out. That's a very important question. What you're saying is maybe Latin Americans are not opting out. They just don't have the chances to actually access these public services. But the truth is that if that was true, you would expect that the poor are the ones that are actually not accessing those services. And massively, the people who remain in those public services are the poor. So
Those really have no option.
those have no option of opting out, exactly. But that's the problem. Precisely those who have the option of opting out, they do opt out. And those who don't have the option of opting out, they don't. And they are getting now much more education. Latin America has improved a lot in terms of providing education for all, but they are getting very low quality education. And that's the big issue. I don't think there is a rationing in terms of accessing to the service. Is the quality of the service that is very, very rational. I mean, you don't get the same type of quality services if you're poor, middle class, or rich. And that's the reason why the middle class opts out. I don't know if I covered them all.
Thank you. Coming back to your comment to Miklos, when you mentioned China, there is a current debate to how to change the focus of the growth in China from exports to internal consumption. In Brazil, the opposite, change from internal consumption to investment. And, my question is how to do that if you have huge vulnerable classes, especially in Latin American countries, which depends heavily on the state. So this tension, isn't that a challenge without a solution from now on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the previous person also pointed out that this causation you're sort of establishing between the growth of the middle classes and the withdrawal or the opting out of the public services. Well, I would like to sort of comment something on that. So my impression is that in Latin America, it's not the middle class is opting out of the services
Brazil about the participation of the civil sector and public people working in the public sector in the middle class, because it's just an impression. There is the wages in the public sector and the retirement of people in the public sector are very high compared with the income, middle income. This is a very outplayed country. Okay? Even because I am a university professor, I am privileged by this. Okay? So, do you think that is the same proportion that the middle of the average Latin America, 1 out of 5 in the public sector in Brazil?
We take one more from Bruno.
Just two quick ones. I'm sure you know this report by the World Bank saying that the World Bank is biased against the poor. So that, they think that the poor are less wise, less resilient, less autonomous. So what I was wondering is, do you find some echo? Actually, I think the research is very interesting. But do you find that this notion has some echo in the population? Have you done something of that sort? Asking people whether they feel vulnerable. They feel the concept of the poor. Do you think that so they think of themselves as vulnerable. Would that concept resonate with them? Have you done some kind of research also on that aspect, or do you think it makes sense? The second one is actually more linked with the wider subject here. Is whether you think it makes sense to argue that if you have such a large, vulnerable, and poor class, this will constrain you very much in terms of power projection and in terms of a more activist foreign policy. I know it's not directly right, but you can speculate about that.
You mean foreign policy in terms of
So
economic policy, or
in general? So it's harder for these countries to argue, we should spend money sending people abroad, or we should spend money in terms of foreign aid when we have so much to do in terms of social problems in our own backyard, in our own country.
That one. May I maybe those impacts of your imports, exports, if you do something internationally and you're vulnerable might be hit by that as well. Perhaps energy in some countries, maybe Argentina and Chile might be interesting because I don't think that some of the other countries need so much energy imports, but it's just like one example.
Well, the first question was very difficult. I don't know how to change the growth model. Very, very challenging. I think Brazil has clearly, they know where the problems are, they don't know how to solve them. Brazil has a big problem of actually being able to invest. They have huge bottlenecks. They have an economy that is extremely sort of stagnated. You can see it in Brazil grows at 4% and inflation goes out of the roof. It hits very, very easily sort of a limit of growth at levels that are extremely low. That's partly because it's a very sclerotic country in terms of sort of dealing with those bottlenecks. The question is how to deal with those bottlenecks, how to attract foreign investment. I think Dilma had this idea, but it's how to do it. I mean, she tried and she's trying, I think, but it's a very big challenge. I think China is not in the same type of problem. The big problem in China is going to be how to actually accommodate all these people. Going to start demanding more goods and they're going to start demanding housing and so on and so forth. But it's in a much better position, I would say, to change the model. It's going to be challenging, but it's going to be, I think it is more feasible.
Just can I contest
Sure.
your issue of Brazil? Okay. I don't see, first of all, people, for sure, a significant part of more internationalized economies know about what is the problem in Brazil. But there is a lot of elites, not a mass public, that don't know about how to solve the problems. And believe in a lot of fantasies, and Dilma particularly. If you look at, it's not only the the electoral campaign. It was a world of fantasy, nothing to do with reality. But also in the previous years, it was all the way they were perceiving the problems was very, very distorted. First of all, they were closing the economy, in which one major issue for increasing productivity, that is key for the Brazilian economy, was open the economy, and they were closing the economy. So I don't think they have perceived the problems. I mean, the problem is much more deep, precisely because they don't mean a significant part of the Brazilian elites and mass public don't perceive.
No, I can see that. I can see that. I was more referring to the fact that Dilma had, at least at some point, had this speech which ended up in not being sort of much in terms of actual facts, but she had this speech about increasing investments, and those increases could not come from the public sector, they had to come from the private sector. There was a lot of discussion about the public-private partnership that ended up in nothing. I thought those were in the right direction, but you're right, that then they were not taken into anything in terms of actual changes in policy. So maybe, yes, there is even more of a problem of actually not understanding what is fundamentally needed. I don't know those numbers from the top of my head, whether Brazil is relies more on the public sector jobs than it does. It's true that Brazil is totally crazy. It's a complete outlier in terms of public sector wages. So I'd be surprised. I mean, I would say probably most of them will just want to get this job because they are probably rational, right? So there is a question of...
There is a profession now that in Brazil that is concurseiro.
People
who go to public, so it is the more talented people in the university, they start finishing the graduation, is studying for public competition for having a public service job.
So someone asked about vulnerability, whether the Latin Americans feel vulnerable. That's a very interesting question. The Latin Americans are a little bit schizophrenic when they are asked about how they feel about themselves. I don't know the precise answer to that question, but I know some hints of answer to that question, I think. Which is when Latin Americans are asked, do you think your future is going to be better than your present? They say no, overwhelmingly. Then when they are asked, do you feel your kids are going to have a better future than you? They say yes, overwhelmingly, which is kind of strange. So I do think they do feel vulnerable. I think they do feel vulnerable, and they are worried about the future. In that sense of vulnerability, I don't know about other dimensions. There was a question about foreign policy and whether the resilience to shocks and outside shocks. I think Latin America is way more resilient than it used to be in many dimensions. We saw it in the 2009 crisis, where the first reaction of the markets was Latin America, there's going to be bank runs, let's get out of Latin America, and it lasted like for a couple of weeks, and then normality came back into place. Latin America has changed in terms of how macro policies are done, so it's much less vulnerable to external shocks than it used to be in the 90s and very early 2000s. Having said this, of course, it's still vulnerable, and the big challenge here is, for instance, how to accommodate the reduction in commodity prices that we are seeing. But what we have seen so far is that there's been a stagnation of some of these trends. In some countries, still Brazil is a very interesting case. It's not growing, but still poverty is still declining, and middle class is still growing. There is a big conundrum in Brazil about what happens when you observe the household data, where they tell you income of people is growing, and then when you look at the macro data, you see the country is not growing. So where is this growth coming from? I don't know, but there is a big difference there. We are not observing any sort of reverse trend in inequality or in poverty yet in Latin America, even though growth in some countries is even negative, like in Argentina. So there is some resilience there. To what extent this resilience is bulletproof, obviously, it's a big important policy. I don't know.
Yes?
I
on that because for China, what is being said now is that the middle class is growing, but rather than contesting the government and demanding more participation, they are rather stabilizing the system. And so, I mean, that depends probably on to what extent the Chinese government can maintain the growth rate they have, and also from the numbers we had, we were saying China's not yet a middle class country because in absolute numbers, yes, they are huge, but in relative numbers not. So just thinking about that.
Yeah, I don't know whether there is a threshold at which these effects that we are finding trigger out. I don't know. That's an interesting question. That's something that we could ask the data. I mean, this data is very limited, so asking this type of questions to already a limited data set is complicated. But one could ask to this type of data whether there is some non-linearity there. Maybe just when you enter middle class status, that doesn't mean that changes in policies take place. You need to have sort of a well-established middle class, and then these changes happen. I don't know. It's a question. When we did the analysis of the values of the middle class, we didn't find anything special about the values of the middle class. So we tend to think, this is open to discussion, that the middle class acts mostly on self-interest. So to the extent that democracy is perceived as something that is going to improve my well-being, then obviously the middle class is going to demand for it. I mean, in China, after growing at 10%, it seems to be difficult, kind of saying, why are we going to change things? I think we're doing great, relatively speaking.
I mean, I don't want to take the time of this.
Yeah, no.
The other people, the students, I mean, this is they have the priority. Nobody No, just a question about interesting related to the last question. In the case of Brazil, the public demonstrations and social unrest in 2013 was coming from the part from the middle class and part from the vulnerable, not from the poor, not from the okay. And there was, it's interesting because how this translate, there was a problem of exhaustion and mobilization because of violence. This is another question. But in 2014, in the election, there was a major battle for the mind and hearts of the vulnerable, in which one of the things that was very interesting is that the marketing, electoral marketing people of the government, we are more smart in producing narrative of reality about the vulnerable, for these vulnerable people. These vulnerable people, we are already complaining a lot about corruption, about the wrong priorities, not public transportation by the nation studies, things like this. But they were persuaded by the public, the propaganda of the incumbent president that they could lose. So they need to, changing could be increasing the risk of losing, of the really moving from vulnerable to poor again. So better to bet in continuity, that we will try to improve the situation, something like that. It was very, very interesting.
It's very interesting. I mean, Brazil took advantage, to some extent used the 2009 crisis to extend Bolsa Familia to unprecedented levels, right? I mean, so many of those vulnerable, which are not poor, are recipients of Bolsa Familia. So to some extent, I think they were.
Do you think that many of those vulnerable are recipients of Bolsa Familia?
Yeah. It's basically
because you know that the most important change driving in the development of this new middle class or part of the lower middle class is related to the increase of the minimum wage significantly higher than the average wage. This happened since '97, and it is when further starting in 2004. And this is the major drive of the transformation. It's not because.
That's totally true, and I agree. I mean, Bolsa Familia, for those of you who don't know what it is a conditional cash transfer program, which is what Latin Americans sort of put in fashion during the 2000s, which is a direct transfer of money to the poor. In principle, it's targeted, and it has these objectives of, it's conditional in the sense that you have to do something, like we condition on you having a kid and sending it to school, or we condition on you having a sort of small child and sending it to a clinic so that they
vaccination, things like that. In different countries, it happens everywhere in Latin America, but in Brazil it's tremendously generous. It goes basically, Brazil used a lot the commodity boom, as someone was saying earlier, to basically extend this program, not only to those that are poor, those also who are vulnerable by our definition. These contributed to the reduction of poverty, that's undeniable, but it's also totally undeniable that labor incomes were a major driver, and probably the minimum wage has had something. Well, there's a debate about whether it's a lot, but it had something to do with it. So it was market incomes as well. So do all the vulnerable need Bolsa Familia to actually remain vulnerable and not becoming poor again? Probably not. But obviously, I understand this as a narrative, right? Brazil it's a very interesting case because these vulnerable are being taxed now. So they are getting revenue sometimes from Bolsa Familia, so from these transfers, but they are also being taxed. And that's part of the reason they are demonstrating. They are saying, okay, now we're being taxed and we get all these shitty services. We have to commute for 2 hours to go to work. There are no good buses. There are no good schools. So there is more voice associated with these new middle classes or these new vulnerable classes, which is part of the story of what's going on. I think Brazil will have a hard time dismantling partially this. I think they know that they've gone too far with the conditional cash transfer program, but the question is how to dismantle it or how to make it more rational or more targeted.
We still have 5 minutes, so I would like to advance the hypothesis for all of us to think about it. It seems to me that urban mobility has not led to productivity gains, at least in Latin America, and it still has very low productivity. And the second point, middle class is usually less keen on being mobilized to the charity, for example, than before. And the third dimension is that because of loss aversion, the rural class may be more prone to contestation and rebellion than established middle class. So these three events may turn these countries more vulnerable than before. So this middle class miracle, such as that's trumpeted in China and Brazil, may have negative rather than positive consequences for power projections. And I'm looking at the history of Greece right now and Argentina. Greece was and still is a middle class society. Argentina was kind of a vulnerable society. And the same kind of adjustment, and 35% of decline in GDP per capita and the like, led to a change of government in Greece, which may be tragic according to European contemporary standards. It's just a change of government. When Argentina brought down 4 presidents in 10 days. So the vulnerable class rebel much more because they are afraid of becoming poor again. While the middle class in Greece, they think they are continuing to be middle class. This is not for you to answer. It's for us to know that those that for Lula was a big achievement and for China as well may not be. So in the future.
So you're saying that the vulnerable will be more ready, in the case, your hypothesis applies to the case of Brazil, the vulnerable will be more ready for contestation than the established middle.
This is because of this thing of loss aversion, a psychological concept that
This was what happened in the election. In the election, the narrative of change was the opposition. And the narrative of continuity was the vulnerable. And these vulnerable people were persuaded more by the idea that
it depends
to
on
be non-change, changes could be dangerous, it's better to bet in the continuum.
But it is still about normal times. I think
It's not Argentina or Greece.
when you're shocked, then you react. The poor were always poor, so what else can they expect? When the vulnerable class, they think they are middle class, but they are afraid they can become poor again, so they're rebel.
While I do agree on the general effect, what I am less, I don't think Argentina 2001 is something that can happen again in Latin America. I'm more optimistic in that particular. I mean, Greece is back to the euro. I mean, that's the big thing that Greece has. That is basically, and Latin America has moved into a system that is well more resilient.
So it's not as vulnerable.
As vulnerable. So it could happen, but I don't think this type of shocks are likely to happen.
much. Thank you, everybody.